Hi everyone, my name is Alex Diesner. I'm a senior at ASU FITM studying fashion design. My final project is titled Fully Fashioned: How Knitwear Can Reduce Fashion's Waste Issue. As a designer, sustainability and how to approach it is one of the most crucial things to think about as I begin my career. Throughout my research on how to approach sustainability, a key area struck out to me the most, and that is the textile waste produced in garment manufacturing. In garment production, around 13 to 15% of textiles from the cut and sew method are thrown away as scraps. Knitwear, on the other hand, and especially when fully fashioned, produces essentially zero waste, as the pattern for the garment is the textile itself, whereas cut and sew utilizes a paper pattern to cut out the pieces from fabric itself. These two garments are examples that I've knitted using the fully fashioned method, showcasing how knitwear can be applied and engineered to create one-of-a-kind custom garments. For my final project, I decided to apply my knowledge, skills, and research to develop a new garment while documenting the waste that I produced while making it. Let me show you how I made it. First, let's talk about the cut and sew method. In the cut and sew method, which is the primary method used in garment manufacturing, a paper pattern is placed on top of fabric and is then cut out. The remaining fabric is generally discarded as scraps, which is one of the main issues in the garment manufacturing process with waste. Around 13 to 15% of all textiles in the cut and sew method end up discarded as waste. After the pattern's been cut out, it's then taken to an overlocker machine, which helps to cleanly finish the seam while also allowing the knit to continue to stretch. The first step of knitting is to do a cast on. With this particular cast on, I did what's called a rib cast on, which uses 2 beds of needles. After my first row, I place a cast-on comb between each of the stitches to help the machine knit properly. Without a cast-on comb and the weights that you can see here, the knit stitches wouldn't either knit or they would end up falling off the machine, meaning you would then have to restart. The next step is to do 2 rows of a tubular knit. This helps to glide over the comb and to also create a much nicer looking finish. I then transition to doing a traditional 1x1 rib, and I do 10 rows of waste yarn cast on. Waste yarn is pretty important in knitting as it helps to remove any distortion that can sometimes happen in the beginning rows. After I knit my 10 rows, I then switch to a pull thread. Pull thread allows me to separate the waste yarn from the final panel, and I knit 2 rows of it. After the pull thread's been cast on, I then switch to my final yarn. After doing 8 rows of 1x1, I then transfer all those stitches up to the main top bed. I left 4 on the edge, which is the side where the slit is, and then I also left 2 in a random location on the bottom to help me create an organic vine traveling cable knit. A cable is two stitches or two or more stitches that cross over each other in an X-like pattern. Here I am doing my first transfer, where I transfer the cable around so it creates movement. After I finish my actual pattern piece, I cast it off with waste yarn. I then rehang it after I get to the same spot on my actual front panel so that I can knit them together to create a nice seamless finish. Here I am removing the waste yarn after the final product. This was an incredibly satisfying moment, as I'd never actually done something like this before, but it's definitely a technique I plan on using again. Here I'm using the pull thread in the initial cast on to remove the waste yarn from the bottom so that the bottom hem edge has a nice clean finish. After I remove my waste yarn, my next step is to finally link the garment together, essentially sewing it together. This particular machine is a linking machine from Flying Tiger. While the machine itself can be motorized, I've opted to use the hand cranking method to help reduce my carbon footprint. This is an incredibly satisfying moment because it's really fun to see the garment all come together finally. Here's what the final seam looks like after it's been linked together. You can also see the eyelets, which are fully fashion marks where I grew the fabric itself out. Finally, I get to weave in my tail threads, and the final garment is done. The final garment I designed was this cowl neck halter gown with the left side slit. If this type of garment would have been produced using the cut and sew method, it would have needed to be cut on the bias, which is a 45-degree angle that gives a woven fabric mechanical stretch and provides a fluid drape, like many evening gowns from the 1930s. This garment, being a fully fashioned knit, is able to achieve similar results to the bias cut gown while producing very little waste. In fact, this is the amount of waste that was produced while I was making this particular garment. The waste yarn from the cast on doesn't actually have to be considered waste, as I can unravel the piece, tie it back onto the cone, and use it a couple more times before the integrity of the yarn begins to break down. Unfortunately, in garment manufacturing, these waste yarn pieces would most likely be discarded, as the time and energy it would take to do it for each individual piece would end up outweighing the consequences of discarding it. Ultimately, fully fashioned knitwear is being looked at by many designers and brands to be a relatively sustainable way to not only manufacture new clothing, but to also utilize its capabilities to recycle our old clothing. In 2020, H&M launched the Loop system, the first garment-to-garment recycling system that shreds clothing down to its base fibers, respins that fiber into a yarn, and then uses it on a Shimaseki whole garment knitting machine to seamlessly and effortlessly knit a new garment. Although still relatively new, if the Loop system were to be launched globally, the impact on waste reduction from the fashion industry could be drastically lowered if consumers decided to use the system. I hope that my project was able to give you some insight on how our clothes are made and the impact that transitioning from cut and sew to fully fashioned knitwear could have on reducing the waste in garment manufacturing. Thank you for watching.